So now I'd like to introduce Jan Rivers. Jan is a former public servant, originally from England and living in Wellington. She's an activist and has done work for open government and against trade agreements. Her activism has roots in lesbian and feminist politics. Together with Jill Abigail, she has written a policy paper on the problems with gender medicine and children and young people in New Zealand. More recently, they have co-written another paper entitled "What Do They Do in the Shadows? The Rapid Implementation of Gender Ideology in the New Zealand Public Sector." Jan, would you please tell us about yourself and your activism and what issue currently concerns you the most?
Kia ora koutou. So for a long time, I've worked on other things. You know, I started work on these issues of women's rights back in late 2018. But before that, I was doing things on open government and on trade agreements. And it was when I started seeing women being kind of metaphorically beaten up on social media that I kind of started to look and see what was going on with this issue. And I found it impossible to let go of since. So the two issues, as Janet mentioned, that I've been working on, one of them is about puberty blockers and the effects and the effects that gender medicine is having on young people. And the second one is this whole issue of what it might be called policy capture. So I guess if I'm thinking about how that fits in terms of the women's human rights campaign, it sort of fits under topics of, you know, that the rights of women are based on the category of sex, that we have rights to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, that we have rights to political organization on the basis of sex, and also around the children and medicine, the idea of that being where the protecting the rights of the child become important. So the real impetus to what I've been doing has been around policy, was the article by Lucy Blackburn and anyway, the article from Scotland, which was about policy capture in Scotland. And Jill and I started to look at what was going on. And what we discovered was that self-identification in public policy was happening irrespective of the fact that the law had not been passed. And moreover, that the whole idea of gender ideology throughout the New Zealand public sector is completely ubiquitous. It's as if the whole of the public sector has been captured. And partly that's been as a result of, well, I mean, obviously international stuff, but specifically, and this sounds good in some ways, our State Sector Act, which had been an act which kind of brought in neoliberalism, which dated from the mid-80s, was changed for a thing called the Public Services Act. And in some ways, that's good for government. It sort of makes it a more democratic law, but it's brought in inclusion and diversity as a mandate to all public sector organizations. And again, that doesn't sound too bad, except that inclusion and diversity seems far more than any other group of people with disadvantage, like young Māori men or new migrants or refugees or people with disabilities. Transgender people seem to be at the absolute top of the heap in terms of this inclusion and diversity.
How does the issue which concerns you, which the most, how does that affect women's sex-based rights, and what can be done to uphold our sex-based rights?
One of the things that has not happened in our public sector is that they haven't looked across these four pieces of law and looked at either the interrelationships or the unintended consequences. So it seems to me that, for example, with self-ID and hate speech, it's all very well saying that you can challenge somebody on the basis of sex if it turns out to be hate speech to actually identify that somebody is transgender. You know, that's the kind of thing that we don't really know about yet. And for example, you know, if it's hate speech to say that children, that children are badly affected by gender medicine, you know, that, I mean, there are all sorts of potential hidden hooks and traps, I think, in these laws. And nobody, you know, the wonderful thing with the public sector is that they they talk about accountability, which means I'm going to look after my plot and make sure that nobody can kick my ass, but I'm actually not going to look across a whole range. And as we've taken our policy paper round, it's become quite clear that there are no open doors in government to make them aware of large systemic overriding problems. Those doors just do not exist. It's impossible to find the person who can say, bloody hell, you've shown me a huge systemic problem. I think we need to, take that to X and kind of come together with a kind of cross-agency working party that looks at this. They simply don't have that kind of ability. So this was the spur for our work. It was the article by Kath Murray and Lucy Hunter Blackburn, the way the Scottish government worked. And they discovered that despite the lack of self-ID, they were changing the census and changing the prison system. And that was the spur to what we were doing. And we did quite a big piece of work. And we looked, first of all, across some generic things, but then we started looking down and we did some case studies of individual government agencies. So the Human Rights Commission, there are a number of problems there. Its role is to encourage harmonious relationships between individuals and the diverse populations in New Zealand. It simply doesn't do that with respect to women. On every occasion when there is a conflict between the rights that women have and the rights that transgender people have, they come down on the side of transgender people. So if that means transgender women in women's refuges or in women's gyms or in women's sports, like with Laurel Hubbard, they are vocal. They don't speak out for women ever, but they often speak out for transgender people. Back in, I think, 2019, they did a huge report, which was almost like their calling card to the next government about what they wanted to see. And it had all sorts of quite shocking things in there, like that everyone has a gender identity. They said that lesbian and gay legal and social issues have been met and there are no further problems. That's why they have to focus on transgender people. And they also redefined homosexuality as same gender attraction. And they act as if the Yogyakarta principles are law, as if self-ID is already in place. And even as they do that, they put in their briefing to the incoming minister that we don't actually have these rights yet, even though we've been pretending, acting as if we have. A public services unit, it used to be the state sector, State Services Commission. It's now the Public Services Commission. And the one thing that I wanted to mention is that in the same way that Stonewall work in order to influence government in the UK, there's a part of government which, well, a lot of our government agencies are signed up to something called the Rainbow Tick, which is a bit of an authentication. How well are we doing? And it has the same kinds of effects of creating a competition between government agencies. And the way that plays out is through a biannual combined agencies Rainbow Network Gala Conference, which happens in Parliament. And that's where all of the government agencies kind of show off to each other about how well they're doing on not so much lesbian and gay stuff, but mostly transgender stuff. Another thing that happened about 2019 was that our Ministry of Social Development, which looks after pensions and social welfare, disability benefits, decided without any policy work, without any analysis, without any public notification, without any consultation, except with rainbow organisations, that they would allow any client to self-ID, including to say that they were non-binary. And that whole idea that this whole thing about gender ideology is to get rid of sex as a category, effectively in the UK, people have gone to law to hold a judicial review in order to say that they're non-binary. In New Zealand, it happened without even policy work. They said it wasn't policy work. And somebody from the Human Rights Commission, in the consultation we did this through an Official Information Act request, said, we keep this undercover, we don't want it in the media. There are some fantastic other examples that we uncovered around prisons, around Stats. Stats New Zealand has relabeled sexual orientation the same as the Human Rights Commission, as same gender attraction. It said that sometimes sex can change over the course of a lifetime. it ran an entire year, a consultative group consisting entirely of transgender activists in order to inform this whole process. And at the end, after having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, they came up with a standard which cannot be used for medicine. So it can't actually be used to determine sex in medicine.
What do you think we can do going forward to protect women's sex-based rights in the future?
I've been looking just recently about what's been happening overseas, and some of the things that look hopeful and that therefore we need to really focus on. And some of them are aspirational, I guess, and some of them are kind of realistic. And at the moment, one of the things that's really, really important about what's happening in New Zealand as compared with overseas is the absolutely minimal focus that we get in New Zealand's media. And I think we really need to make that a big topic. And I think that there's a really good case for a report on exactly what's happening in New Zealand's media. On only one occasion has the fundamental statement about what our concerns are being made clear in the media, to say that, you know, in TV3 News about a month ago, there was the line along the lines of, Speak Up for Women are concerned that women's rights are going to be overridden if self-ID is brought into place. And never before or since has that been made so clear. You know, the descriptions are always controversial group seeks ... And the other thing is that when Speak Up for Women took a court case, that was in the news. When they won the court case, it was barely in the news. So, whereas, for example, in the UK, you've got commentators from the Financial Times and the Spectator to the Morning Star and the New Statesman. So you've got a really broad range of coverage. So we need to make sure that we take a case to the Media Council or some other way of really raising that issue. In the UK, there have been the various court cases like the Forstetter case and the Akua Reindorf report on Essex University. And those pieces of work, which should be influential in New Zealand, that case needs to be made. As Beth alluded, I think it's appalling that we're being put in this situation where instead of implementing principles-based law that can be broadly understood, that we're actually looking at a situation where the situation for women is going to be dealt with through a court case. And I think it's really important that as we make submissions to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Act, that we make that clear. You know, the law is about principles and it's about abiding situations. It's not about creating a situation where case law actually decides how things happen. We can't afford $100,000 every time the law is overridden to the disadvantage of women. Just like Stonewall in the UK, we can't allow our public service to have its influence ceded to third-party organisations with vested interests. There's a whole lot about academic freedom, about free speech. I'm really interested in an article that I read recently about what's going on in Sweden, and how in Sweden, the belief that somebody's written a very persuasive article, a guy called Lindstrom, about how the fact that COVID got away in Sweden was because of the postmodernist beliefs of the Swedish government. And I think that it's a very convincing article. And then the other thing I think we need to do is partner with scientists, artists, restaurants, all the other people within New Zealand society who are being cancelled. And I think ultimately we should look at a law commission review as a part of the New Zealand government that will sort of review overriding things. And I haven't worked out how we get to speak to them yet. In theory, we should be able to approach Transparency International, which is an organisation that sort of talks about probity in government, but I'm not holding out great hopes for that. The other thing that I just wanted to say is that when Speak Up for Women, Beth and others defeated, the law the first time round, it was with about 5 women who could be named. And we now know that we could probably identify almost up to 1,000 women who are involved in this fight now. not that many of them out there in public. There'd be a couple of hundred whose names are in public, but I think that's a real good part of our strength into the future.